down. How about that? 765-4321. The Subcommittee on Elections of the Committee on House Administration will now come to order. Let me begin just by saying good morning to everyone. And looks like we will end our week work today, and we will not be in session tomorrow. And so many of us are trying to get a whole lot done today before we leave Washington. But as we begin this morning, I want to note that we are holding this hearing remotely and in compliance with the regulations for remote committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolution 8. Generally, we ask any committee members and witnesses to keep their microphones muted when not speaking to limit background noise. Members will need to unmute themselves when seeking recognition or when recognized for their 5 minutes. Witnesses will also need to unmute themselves when recognized for their 5 minutes or when answering a question. Please keep your camera on at all times, even if you need to step away for a moment. Please do not leave the meeting or turn your camera off. At this time, I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any point, and that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and have any written statements be made part of the record. I hear no objections. It will therefore be ordered. My friends, we are here today to examine the impact of election-related disinformation, misinformation, malinformation. The acronym for this now is referred to as MDM, targeted at communities of color, and the impact of MDM on voters who consume information primarily in languages other than English. The proliferation of election-related MDM is a threat to our democracy, and it's a threat to the free and fair and equitable access to the ballot that every voter is entitled. Misinformation is false information that is not created or shared with the intent to mislead or to cause harm. Disinformation is false information that is deliberately created to mislead, harm, or manipulate. And experts are now increasingly discussing malinformation. Malinformation seems to be information that is based on fact, but it is used out of context to mislead, harm, or manipulate. The subtle but important difference between the three is that disinformation and malinformation are both created and spread with the intent to harm, whereas misinformation is false, but it is not created to cause harm or not shared to cause harm. Sometimes false information will begin as disinformation or malinformation, but then it will spread. It will continue to spread as misinformation. The proliferation of MDM targeted at communities of color seen during the 2016 and 2018 elections continued at an alarming rate in the 2020 election cycle. We've seen this thing escalate in 16 and 18 and 20. As the 2022 election cycle continues, experts warn that the onslaught of mis and disinformation will continue. Unfortunately, it will continue. It will become more widespread as November draws near. MDM has been weaponized and targeted at communities of color by racist and anti-democratic actors who seek to intimidate voters of color, discourage them from participating in the democratic process. Voters of color are targeted with disinformation narratives, specifically designed to appeal to each community's concerns in ways that will alienate voters and suppress turnout. While social media companies struggle to address disinformation in English, their ability to address it in languages other than English is worse. Fact-checking on social media sites with public-facing posts in languages other than English lags significantly behind English language disinformation. Additionally, for messaging applications, which are incredibly popular in many communities, disinformation spreads unchecked because of the private group chat structure. And so as we consider how best to combat disinformation, it is critically important that we hear from the experts. I'm not the expert. Many of the members of this subcommittee are not the experts. We need to hear from the experts about the challenges, the unique challenges posed by targeted disinformation. Voters deserve to receive accurate information about the democratic process so their voices can be heard. And so with all that said, I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today and learning more about the spread of MDM and how it is targeted at specific communities, targeted at specific voters, and what we as a Congress can do to combat it. And so with all of that said, thank you for listening. I'm now going to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, my friend, Mr. Stow, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think we all look forward to being back and in person again on such an important topic. And I agree, some bad actors seek to influence votes and advance their agenda through half-truths and outright lies. But free speech means that the answer to speech we don't like, or even speech that's harmful, is more speech, not less. And I'd like to add a government truth commission to tell us what they can think. That doesn't mean that each of us don't have a responsibility to tell the truth and speak honestly. We absolutely do. Unfortunately, many voters have lost faith in our elections because of the false narratives being pushed by many on the left. The Biden administration is no exception. I'd like to submit for the record a Washington Post article, fact check from March 2021, in which the president received 4 Pinocchios for his false claims of the Georgia election law, titled Biden Falsely Claims the New Georgia Law Ends Voting Hours Early. That type of false information is dangerous to voters, and I hope we have time to discuss it today.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. Further, for some other examples of this administration's false narratives, on January 19th, President Biden was asked if he believes this year's midterm elections would be legitimate. President Biden responded, quote, "Oh, yeah, I think it easily could be illegitimate. The prospect of being illegitimate is in direct proportion to us not being able to get these reforms passed," end quote. Of course, he's referring to the partisan HR 1 federal takeover of elections that would gut voter ID, removing key voter integrity provisions. Those statements aren't helpful. During an interview with Today Show the next day, the vice president actively contributed by falsely claiming that the upcoming elections may not be free and fair if the Biden administration's partisan agenda does not pass. It was such a copy and paste moment, you have to wonder if the vice president found it Kinko's. Unfortunately, the vice president and many on the left are peddling false narratives that Republican-led states with new election integrity provisions are trying to suppress the vote. It's false. Republicans want it to be easy to vote and hard to cheat. In Georgia, the state's new law didn't suppress the vote. In fact, in Atlanta in November, we saw turnout increase by 17% after the law was implemented. The Constitution is clear, and it states that the federal government does not have the primary role in setting election law. In administering election, it's well within their power to implement states have the power to implement safeguards such as requiring photo ID. It's exactly what states like Georgia did, yet many on the left continue to spread dangerous misinformation about voter ID to suppress the vote. In fact, recent reports highlight how the new Georgia project conducted blatantly partisan voter education in taxpayer-funded public school classrooms that, quote, taught students that voter identification laws are restrictive and make voting more difficult. Voter ID does not deter legal votes. It's a reasonable safeguard to maintain faith in our elections. Any conversation about impacting elections must also include the partisan targeting that occurred with the use of private elections administration funding, including so-called Zucker bucks by election administrators. The Center for Tech and Civil Life, working with Mark Zuckerberg and others on the left, poured $350 million into heavily Democratic areas, including 5 cities in Wisconsin, demonstrating shifting vote totals in favor of Democratic candidates. The amount of private money used to influence election administration, an inherently nonpartisan government responsibility, should concern every American. As part of our focus on free speech today, we call out the falsehoods we have seen pushed by the left, continually claiming that common sense voter integrity provisions, like having to show a voter ID, makes it hard to vote. These types of lies have real consequences and impact people's decisions to vote. I look forward to today's discussion, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
The chairman yields back. Thank you for your opening statement. At this time, I would like to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, my friend, Congressman Davis.
Well, Mr. Chair, thank you again. And I had the honor of being in a committee hearing yesterday that I was a ranking member of, a subcommittee hearing where your daughter was one of the witnesses. So
Thank you. Thank you.
Glad to see her. She did a great job. Please give her my best and tell her thank you for her testimony. And again, I'm glad we're having this hearing today, Mr. Chair, because this topic is incredibly timely and it impacts both sides of the aisle. Before I begin my remarks, I want to point out that I wish we would be together in the hearing room. Even Dr. Fauci's admitted we are out of the pandemic phase, yet here we are again on Zoom, calling each other from across the same complex of buildings. It's time for this nonsense to stop. Digging into today's topic, I think we need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture when it comes to truth, free speech, and what each of us is allowed to think or even say. When we see information that we believe is untrue, we need to speak the truth even louder. Unfortunately, many on the left would rather police speech, claiming this sort of nanny state activity is for our constituents' protection. This type of censorship poses a serious threat to our republic. Silencing those whose opinions you do not agree with is a propaganda and control tactic used by repressive regimes like the Chinese Communist Party, Cuba, and Russia, who believe that freedom of expression is a privilege, not a right. Our former colleague and my former mentee, Mr. Carlos Curbelo, is here today to talk about this firsthand. Unfortunately, specifically by those on the left who are quick to label Unfortunately, specifically by those on the left who are quick to label untrue any speech they find inconvenient or simply disagree with. The question then becomes, who is the arbiter of truth? Who decides what is considered truth or misinformation? Many so-called fact checkers often need fact checking themselves. I think in the 2018 election cycle, Mr. Curbelo and I could point to one that the Washington Post supposed fact checkers did in regards to our attempts to fix a broken healthcare system. Personally, I don't think anyone is qualified to be the ultimate authority on truth except God himself. And it's certainly not the White House. It's not the federal government, not private industry, or frankly, even the media. That's why our First Amendment prevents the government from interfering with each American's freedom of speech. Each of us has the right to share information, debate ideas freely, and form our own opinions without government interference, and then take those opinions and our friends to the polls and elect leaders who share their views and values. This is the bedrock of our constitutional republic. Yet the Biden administration has admitted they are flagging problematic posts that they deem misinformation in the hope of censoring social media. Just this week, we saw Elon Musk make a deal to buy Twitter. This news has caused some on the left to spiral into public meltdowns. And why is that? Apparently because Mr. Musk is a vocal proponent of free speech. MSNBC host Ari Melber said that by owning Twitter, you could, quote, you could secretly ban one party's candidate, secretly turn down the reach of their stuff, and turn up the reach of something else, and the rest of us might not even find out about it until after the election. I mean, imagine that. I could name a few folks on the right who have been warning about and experienced this exact type of censorship for years. So we've seen before how the left's efforts to define the truth and silence any dissent backfire. Look at sanctioned Democrat lawyer Mark Elias, who illegally funded the discredited Steele dossier while working as Hillary Clinton's top lawyer. In March of last year, the Fifth Circuit recognized his aversion to the truth and sanctioned him for being less than truthful with the court. And the Durham investigation continues to show us that the idea of Russian collusion was entirely made up. But heaven forbid anyone try to voice disagreement with the progressive gospel. Or the all-out censoring 2 years ago of any news stories relating to Hunter Biden's laptop. The left, in their infinite wisdom, decided that this was a story no one should read because of its inconvenient timing, so it was labeled misinformation. Yet 2 years later, even the New York Times had to backtrack and confirm that the original story was true. The real reason today's hearing was called is because the outgoing majority must have seen the data, including from Equus Labs, which is testifying for them today, which shows that Democrats are losing Latino voters. It's becoming increasingly clear that rather than try and win policy debates on the merits, the left would suppress the speech of their political opponents, labeling it misinformation in a desperate attempt to keep power. The point is this: unlike some on the left, I believe the American people are smart enough to form their own opinions and identify truth from fiction. They don't need a government truth commission restricting access to information or, frankly, telling them what they can say. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yield back.
And thank you to the ranking member for your opening statement, and thank you for the kind words you said about my daughter. In just a moment, I will introduce today's witnesses, but before I do so, as a reminder to the witnesses, each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes, and that 5 minutes can go very quickly. There is a timer on your screen. Please be sure that you can see the timer and are mindful of the 5-minute time limit. Your entire written statements will be made part of the record, and the record will remain open for at least 5 days for additional materials to be submitted. And so I welcome each of our witnesses today. Joining us today is Stephanie Valencia Iquiz, Emily Chi, and I'm a Southern boy, and I butcher names very badly, and please excuse me. But Emily is with us today, and thank you. She's with the American Advancing Justice Group, referred to as AAJC. And Valencia, I might say, is with Labs. The next witness is Joy Cheney of the National Urban League, Professor Samuel Woolley from the University of Texas at Austin, and former Congressman, our friend Carlos Cabello. Finally, Stephanie Valencia is the co-founder and president of Equus, a set of organizations working to create a better understanding of Latinos in the U.S. through research, polling, and analysis. She has spent her career working in Congress, working in the White House, working at Google, and as an advisor. Next is Emily Chi. Emily is the Director of Telecommunications Technology and Media for Asian Americans Advancing Justice, where she is responsible for developing and providing public policy research, strategies, analysis, and education on telecommunications, technology, and media diversity. Prior to joining AAJC, Ms. Chi worked as a researcher on various projects at the Harvard Kennedy School. Next is Joy Cheney. Joy is the Executive Director of the Washington Bureau and Senior Vice President of Policy and Advocacy for the National Urban League. Ms. Cheney is a domestic legal policy expert. She is a political strategist and former Chief of Staff to Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York. Samuel Woolley is the Program Director of the Propaganda Research Lab at the Center for Media and Engagement at the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Woolley's research is focused on how emergent technologies are used in and around global political communication. Former Congressman Carlos Cabello served as representative from North Carolina. Almost said North Carolina. I did say North Carolina. I meant Florida. Let me try that one again. The former congressman is served as a representative from Florida's 26th congressional district from 2015 to 2019. Today, he heads Vocero, a public affairs firm, and serves as an on-air analysis for NBC News and MSNBC and Telemundo and several other groups. And so thank you to each one of the witnesses for joining us today. Ms. Valencia, I think we will start with you. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start by thanking the committee for having me here today and for having this hearing. Very important. for the health of our democracy. As you mentioned, ECIS works to better understand Latino attitudes in the United States. Since early 2019, we have been monitoring disinformation targeting Latinos, identifying examples that violate the platform's terms of service, and comparing the treatment of disinformation in English compared to Spanish. Our findings have been clear. Disinformation is bad in English, but it is even worse in Spanish. And I would go as far to say that it is a problem of hemispheric proportions because of the connectivity that US Latinos have to the region. The free flow of information knows no borders. Latinos often encounter disinformation and misinformation in part because of how much time they spend online. Increasingly, Latinos are opting to use social media platforms to get news about what is happening in the world and their place in it. YouTube, Facebook, and WhatsApp are some of the most used platforms. And according to our research, 47% of Latinos use YouTube as a news source often in a typical week. And overall, our communities are on the platform twice as much as non-Latino adults. It's probably fair to say that Univision's biggest competition is not just Telemundo anymore. It's the latest influencer on YouTube trying to reach Latinos. The same goes for messaging apps. WhatsApp is ubiquitous in the Latino community. About half of Latinos in the United States use it, more than any other ethnic or racial group in the country. And chances are that a Latino in the US today is in multiple WhatsApp groups with their family and friends, their kids' soccer team, or maybe their local church group. You'll likely find the latest Que Dios te le bendiga meme from your tia there, and you'll also find disinformation and misinformation from misleading narratives around the election to voting to false claims around COVID vaccines. WhatsApp is a powerful platform, but its end-to-end encryption makes it very difficult and a very efficient vector for disinformation. My point here is that the reality of a highly digital Latino media landscape combined with a sizable information gap in Spanish language news and minority-owned media in the United States opens up a world in which many Latinos are exposed to the very real effects of disinformation on a regular basis. One of the lasting effects of disinformation on Latinos, which is not a feature, but rather is a feature, not a flaw to those seeding it, is that people are losing trust in news, information, and institutions, period. Latinos, like other voters, are confronted with new and strange contradictory information, often presented as fact. The true danger is not that they're believing it. We actually found that largely they are not. We're not stupid. Rather, they're reacting with a rational skepticism to any new information they receive, true or false. As a result, too many people are becoming more unsure about what to believe at all anymore. That's the worst result, and that is bad for our community, our country, and our democracy. In February of this year, ECIS conducted a poll of over 2,400 Latinos to better understand the scope of their exposure to disinformation and how to course correct. Our poll found that Latinos had a high level of familiarity with many of the disinformation narratives we tested, from the false claim that Trump won the 2020 election to the claim that the earth is flat. A small subset of people did believe some of those false narratives, but it was rather small. Those respondents tended to actually be more politically engaged, college-educated, and affluent, largely voters that are blinded by partisanship. The bulk of Latinos, however, were able to spot what was questionable. They didn't yet outright believe it, but they didn't also feel equipped to dismiss it either. They weren't sure what was true or what was false. This high degree of uncertainty is a serious threat, but it is not a permanent state and thus easier to address than deeply rooted beliefs. That amenability to change reinforces the value of efforts to reinforce and strengthen and amplify fact-based good information online. The flow of Spanish language disinformation online is complex and frequently cyclical. Election-related disinformation and misinformation in Spanish has not stopped circulating since November 2020, and we expect it to continue to spread through the 2020 midterms and beyond. While Russian state-funded media has recently been blocked by YouTube globally, on Meta they continue to promote false and misleading content. Russia Today in Espanol, a Russian-controlled state media outlet, continues to spread false and misleading information as well as conspiracies in Spanish about the situation in Ukraine, in the US, and throughout the region. Disinformation originating in the United States, often in English, is also co-opted and spread quickly in Spanish, including by foreign accounts and influencers in Latin America, who then spread this disinformation back to Spanish speakers in the United States. This cycle also happens with disinformation originating from Latin America. With many Latinos in the United States maintaining strong ties to their home countries in Latin America, and we found that 44% of U.S. Latinos get their news and information from other countries at least sometimes, our monitoring has found that users in the United States are actively searching on YouTube for popular Spanish language channels, including from Latin America, sometimes more than Spanish language news sources in the United States.
I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up, if you will.
Let me just say that not all technology is bad. The internet has helped foster community, kept families connected, and helped small businesses find new customers. The internet has sparked democratic revolutions from Cuba to the Middle East. But the current challenges that we face are huge and hemispheric in proportion, and the social media platforms must be held accountable. Thank you.
And thank you. Ms. Chi, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Butterfield and Ranking Member Style, for the opportunity to address the subcommittee today. My name is Emily Chi. I'm the Director of Telecommunications, Tech, and Media Diversity at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, a national nonprofit and nonpartisan organization that works through policy advocacy, community education, and litigation to advance the civil and human rights of Asian Americans and to build and promote a fair and equitable society for all. The Asian American diaspora is extremely diverse, with 66% of the population speaking a language other than English at home, and it continues to be the nation's fastest growing racial group. Language limitations can make it difficult for Asian Americans to obtain accurate and helpful information. Many turn to ethnic media outlets such as in-language newspapers or local TV channels, but ethnic media channels are not always available, especially since funding and support are dwindling. And in this absence of legitimate news sources, many immigrant communities are increasingly relying exclusively on information shared on community forums, messaging apps, Facebook, Twitter, and other social media platforms. On these platforms, individuals can become more susceptible to mis and disinformation as content becomes more decentralized, difficult to trace, unverified, exaggerated, or even doctored as it's being shared. For example, in lieu of verified in-language news sources like radio, many in the Vietnamese American community are now visiting YouTube channels that regularly spread mis and disinformation. And this is exacerbated by the fact that most social media companies and other platform companies are not dedicating the same amount of resources for non-English language content as they are with English content. This is the first type of mis and disinformation that harms Asian American communities, the content that's created for, shared with, and spread by Asian American communities. This content is often presented in Asian language, and it's specialized to manipulate issues that are the most controversial to these communities, and then disseminated amongst trusted messengers. At Advancing Justice AAJC, we've been documenting various mis and disinformation campaigns in Asian communities, which has included potentially dangerous and false information about COVID vaccines, politics, community safety, and immigration. So in one example, there were false claims that the National Guard was being deployed because of impending riots, and this was spread all over in Chinese on a messaging platform called WeChat, to frighten Chinese Americans away from the polls on election day. And these types of false narratives suggest polls could pose a significant danger, which ultimately discourages Asian Americans from engaging in the civic processes, including going out to vote. The second category of mis and disinformation content is about Asian Americans, and it aims to dehumanize, scapegoat, and stoke suspicion against Asian Americans. As demonstrated by the recent surge in anti-Asian hate, Asian Americans are currently suffering from race-related discrimination, harassment, and violence. And when content is suggesting that Asian and Asian Americans are responsible for the spread of COVID-19, and it continues to proliferate on platforms like YouTube, this exacerbates the effect on our communities day to day. Some videos repeatedly insist that China must pay, and on Twitter, China lied, people died became a popular hashtag that baselessly accused Chinese people of intentionally spreading the virus. Derogatory and baseless online content like this has justified and inspired acts of violence targeting our community and perpetuated fear all across communities, in the country, not just Asian American communities. Efforts to dismantle mis and disinformation must consider the specific cultural nuances and community-specific messaging that make Asian American communities uniquely vulnerable to certain disinformation narratives. Immigrant communities often face distinct issues such as limited English language abilities, lack of formal American history knowledge, unfamiliarity with mainstream US political and social dynamics, and different lived experiences from their countries of origin. And that's why it is critical for Congress, other government entities, companies, researchers, technologists, and other stakeholders to prioritize understanding and responding to the needs and challenges of Asian Americans and other minority communities as we address the threat of mis and disinformation together. Thank you so much.
And we thank you as well. Ms. Cheney, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Subcommittee Chairman Butterfield, Ranking Member Still, Committee Ranking Member Davis, and members of this subcommittee and the full committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is indeed Joy Cheney, and I'm Senior Vice President for Policy and Advocacy and Executive Director of the Washington Bureau at the National Urban League. I bring you greetings on behalf of our President and CEO and many of your friend, Mark Morial. As you well know, the National Urban League is an historic civil rights organization dedicated to advancing civil rights and economic empowerment for historically underserved communities, and in particular, the African American community. In our work, the National Urban League has become, like many of you, increasingly concerned about the number of disinformation campaigns that directly target Black communities and the civil rights that have long been fought for by the Urban League. This disinformation attacks, digital terrorism, if you will, on Black communities are also a part of a broader attack on our democracy and a threat to the national security of this nation. It has been widely reported and confirmed that the Russian government interfered with our 2016 presidential election, and Black Americans were a target. The Senate Intelligence Committee's investigation into Russian interference found that no single group of Americans was targeted more than African Americans. The National Urban League State of Black America report has repeatedly reflected over the years on disinformation by both foreign and domestic actors aimed at communities of color, and we have submitted those essays for the record. Some of the examples of disinformation highlighted included a meme leading up to the 2016 election that read, quote, "Avoid the line, vote from home, text Hillary to 59925, which targeted Black and Latinx voters on Facebook and Twitter. And we know the Russian government created an inauthentic social media accounts posing as so-called Black influencers in an attempt to dissuade Black voters from voting. We all remember the Russian fake account Woke Louisa. It was also reported that Black Americans were categorized by the Trump campaign as deterrence voters, or voters they wanted to keep away from the ballot box in 2020. And as we look to the future, these election disinformation tactics could lead to even more extreme consequences in 2022, as 19 states have adopted, frankly, draconian laws, creating new barriers for voters to cast their ballots. Moreover, these bills don't just target all voters, they target or at least have a disproportionate impact on voters of color and other vulnerable populations. Past experience has taught us that this will be accompanied by a rise in online disinformation, also targeting these communities, confusing voters about when and how to cast a ballot, and spreading outright falsehoods aimed at suppressing voter turnout and increasing distrust in both government institutions and, frankly, each other. Moreover, disinformation targeted towards Black communities does not just occur within the vacuum of election cycles. We have also seen disinformation surrounding the protests around the murder of George Floyd, the conversation around reparations, and most frighteningly, the COVID-19 pandemic, aimed at diminishing the seriousness of the virus and discouraging African Americans from getting vaccinated, even as we were disproportionately impacted by the disease and dying at higher rates. So the question now, as President Obama echoed in his Stanford speech over the weekend, the question is, what are we going to do about it? To quote him, I am not convinced that I am convinced that it is possible to preserve the transformative power and promise of the internet while at least mitigating the worst of its harms. The National Urban League, too, is a fierce defender of free speech. But the Constitution also recognizes the need to consider public safety and national security. There must be a whole of government and whole of nation response, including civil society and corporations that work collaboratively to combat disinformation campaigns. Social media companies need to play a proactive role in curbing disinformation, and not just in the election period. The National Urban League was in fact disappointed to see Twitter's board accept Elon Musk's offer to buy the company. And we believe, based on Mr. Musk's own words, that transitioning ownership to him and shielding the company from oversight may have great implications on the fight against disinformation and for civil rights protections that are so important to our constituencies. Worse, the decision was made without consulting the civil rights community. Our letter to the board has been submitted for the record, I believe. We also need legislation that increases transparency into how algorithms operate, particularly websites, content amplification practices, and transparency about content moderation practices. Finally, we need comprehensive voting rights legislation that allows voters to safely and freely cast their ballots, prevents voter intimidation, and combats election sabotage. Until then, the White House and the Department of Justice must use every means in their disposal to enforce existing voting rights laws and protect the right to vote. I look forward to talking to you about this and everything else as we continue and in the question and answer period. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify.
And thank you, Ms. Cheney. I knew where you were going with that last statement, and so I didn't want to interrupt your flow. I knew you wanted to get it in, so thank you very much. You're right, Mark Morial is indeed a great friend. Please give him my regards, if you will.
I will.
Thank you. Professor Willie, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Butterfield, Ranking Member Stile, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for having me here today. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. And greetings from the great state of Texas. For the last 10 years, I have studied how social media, the internet, and the broader media ecosystem are leveraged for control, for the manipulation of public opinion. I currently lead the propaganda research lab at the Center for Media Engagement at UT Austin, where I'm also a faculty member in the School of Journalism and Media. Our team specializes in cutting-edge research aimed at illuminating the ways novel technologies and strategies are harnessed by a wide range of organizations, from governments to extremist groups. For a long time, my primary research focus was upon the technologies that get used to amplify and suppress particular narratives, peoples, and perspectives online. I've written extensively on what my collaborators and I call computational propaganda, a growing area of study in the social and computer sciences, which focuses on how automation and algorithms are used in today's efforts to control the communication ecosystem. After years of work focused on bots, the software tools that get used to automate all sorts of tasks online, including speech over social media, I've come to a conclusion. It is the human impact of computational propaganda and of digital disinformation that we should be most concerned about as a society. The technology behind contemporary manipulation is interesting, but it's often simply a means to an end. And that end is to enable control, coercion, and the status quo. It's easy to see disinformation that is spread over social media as a technological problem with technological solutions. It's also easy to make it a problem of free speech versus censorship. If only it were so simple. In reality, we are dealing with a deep, long-term social problem that is magnified by the internet, and that has as much to do with people's safety and right to vote as it does with free speech. Bluntly, it is the same communities that have long faced repression and injustice in our country that are unduly targeted with disinformation today. Those who purposefully spread false content, whether online or off, often target communities of color. Disinformation aimed at these communities often reaches ahead during elections. There are 4 key things my research team has learned about electoral disinformation targeting communities of color. Some of these findings are more technical, but all point to the need for serious policy and social change. The first is that encrypted and private messaging apps like Meta's WhatsApp and the platform Telegram are crucial tools for communication among communities of color, particularly diaspora communities. They are also critical vectors for political disinformation. They're difficult to study because they're private by design. They also, however, offer very relationally potent communication. We must do more to support communities of color who face constant influence operations on these platforms. 2, groups working to spread disinformation do so using specific content and tactics when they are working to influence minority communities. These attacks often occur in languages other than English. They prey upon sociocultural nuances of particular sub-demographics. This content is often transnational and seeks to sow political apathy and confusion as much as it attempts to persuade. 3rd, political disinformation aimed at communities of color is often tied to COVID-19 conspiracies and falsehoods. This is tactical. Propagandists prey upon very real historical injustices around medical research and racism in the medical system. 4th, finally, and most importantly, disinformation about elections has been aimed at communities of color for a very long time. It is structural. A lot of this happens through offline communication. It is those who spread these falsehoods often work to mislead people about how, when, or where to vote, or about new legislation related to electoral processes in an effort to perpetuate our country's long history of suppressing the vote of people of color. These findings are expanded upon in my written testimony. In the coming weeks, I will also be releasing a report on this very topic with the nonpartisan organization Protect Democracy. That study focuses specifically upon the impact of disinformation aimed at communities of color in Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, from the perspectives of activists and other leaders in those communities. If there's one thing I can leave you with, it's this. Disinformation and propaganda are social and cultural problems first. Considered policy that enacts technological solutions will be useful, but to create laws that truly protect and enfranchise communities of color, those laws must also be socially minded, equitable, and considerate of history. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you very much for your testimony as well. At this time, let's see who our next witness is. Okay, I took it off of the screen. All right, Mr. Cabello, I'm sorry we dropped it off the screen when it came to you, but there you are. It's back up on my screen. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Chairman Butterfield, Chair Lofgren, Ranking Member Stile, and Ranking Member Davis. Thank you for having me here today. And I also want to say hello to my friend, Mr. Aguilar, who I can see on my screen. I was privileged to serve with some of you in Congress, and since my departure from Congress, I've been privileged to receive invitations to testify before House committees from members of both political parties. I admire and appreciate all of you for your service to our country. This important topic of truth, what it means and who defines it, is personal to me. In the 1960s, my parents fled the communist government in Cuba and came to America because they no longer had basic freedoms like freedom of speech. The government had taken them away. So hearing government officials in this country calling for truth commissions and proposing anti-free speech ideas is for me both troubling and, again, personal. Free speech is the bedrock of our country. Our Constitution protects our right to free speech and expression. Voters should have access to all information and viewpoints, not the ones solely approved by the left or the right. The idea of a truth commission sounds more like it should be coming out of dictatorial regimes like those in Cuba, Venezuela, China, and Russia, not from political leaders in the United States. The government should not be involved in arbitrating determinations of truth or restricting those who disagree with the majority viewpoint. Americans, natural born or naturalized, are smart enough to determine for themselves what to read, what to watch, what to listen to, and most importantly, what to believe. That doesn't mean there aren't bad actors spreading bad information meant to deceive. Of course there are. I've consumed news and information in English and Spanish all my life, and I have received misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation in both languages. It simply means that it's not the job of the federal government to be the arbiter of speech and censor viewpoints that may be critical of a particular program or policy advanced by an administration or a Congress. It is neither the role of government to prevent the dissemination of inconvenient truths. The solution, as always, to speech we don't like is to speak more effectively and sometimes more loudly, not for the government to silence bad actors or those who dissent or disagree. Finally, Spanish language media outlets are not to blame for either party's successes or failures with the Latino community. For years, Hispanics were trending Democrat. Republicans back then would have been wrong to blame Spanish language news and opinion shows for that dynamic. Today, we are witnessing a reversal where the community is increasingly supporting Republican candidates. It's a mistake for Democrats to seek scapegoats at Hispanic radio and television stations to explain political misfortunes. More likely, Latino voters, like many Americans of other races and ethnicities, are reacting to high inflation and increase in violent crimes, long and unnecessary school and business closures during the pandemic, and other factors irritating the national mood. I'm concerned that my Democratic friends on this committee recently entertained testimony from a former City of Hialeah mayor and radio host, suggesting that the FCC, the federal government, should pre-clear news stories before they are broadcast on TV or radio, allowing those they deem true and prohibiting those they consider misinformation. Again, I ask, who gets to determine what is true and what is false? Certainly the truth can be determined, but that is up to each of us, every American, to examine the facts and determine for ourselves what is trustworthy and what is not for the government to do so for us. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you, Mr. Cabela, as well. And thank you to all of our witnesses for your testimony. It's now time for member questions. And this is always a very important part of every hearing. It kind of reminds me of cross-examination when I was in a courtroom many years ago. This is really where we can drill down. So let's get it started. We will start with Mr. Aguilar. I think you may be at the top of the list, Pete. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you having this hearing and the importance of this issue. First, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a 2021 report on election disinformation by Common Cause entitled "A Matter of Fact, the Harms Caused by Election Disinformation."
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just have to say, Mr. Chairman, you run a very good hearing. And you're very deferential and collegial to our colleagues, but it is highly frustrating time and time again when the ranking member of the full committee, has his bingo card out and mentions Hunter Biden and Mark Elias and things that just aren't germane to what we're trying to do here. And by saying that just having this hearing, we're stifling speech, is like calling the violent assault on the Capitol a peaceful protest, or saying it was legitimate political discourse. It just isn't. It's just an equivalence that isn't there. Ms. Valencia, in Equus Lab's latest report, you and your colleagues found that there are many examples of Spanish language posts that violate Meta's policies. These same posts being rated false by Facebook's third-party fact-checking partners, but were not removed by Meta. According to Avaz, an online activist group, Facebook failed to issue warning labels on 70% of misinformation in Spanish compared to 29% in English. Can you share the harm in Facebook's Spanish language misinformation and disinformation gap and how it translates to disenfranchising a Spanish-speaking electorate?
Thank you, Congressman Aguilar, for that question. What we have found, and as I stated in my opening statement, is a real asymmetry, not just with Meta, but with many of the social media platforms, an asymmetry in how they are treating English language disinformation and how they are treating Spanish language disinformation. There are times where we see real lags when posts violate terms of service in English and they are taken down many days, weeks, months, and perhaps sometimes never. Those same narratives or posts that are in Spanish reaching Latinos are not necessarily taken down. Now, there are a number of things that that the platforms can be doing to potentially close that asymmetry, including disclosing or being more transparent about the kinds of resources they are allocating to monitoring Spanish language disinformation in the same way that they do in English. They have actual people who are monitoring not just their machine learning models and their algorithms to monitor and understand what is happening in both English and Spanish with these different posts and how far they're reaching. They have actual humans who are doing that. So a question to the platforms is, how many people do they have doing that in Spanish versus how many are doing that in English? How they are using machine learning, not just in English, but also in Spanish to track those same posts and narratives as well, are things that the platforms could be doing to better chase down and better kind of capture those same narratives in Spanish in addition to English.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Professor Woolley, you're currently working on a research project with Protect Democracy, where you're examining the overarching themes of disinformation that target communities of color. This includes a technology used to target these communities. Can you explain the practice of micro-targeting and how they impact voters, especially Latinos and other communities of color?
Certainly. So way back in 2016, when we had the Cambridge Analytica scandal, there was a lot of conversation about micro-targeting, what Cambridge Analytica called psychographic targeting. They could use people's emotions to target folks on an individual level. Well, some of that turned out to be a little bit of smoke and mirrors, but what we are seeing is that there is serious targeting of sub-demographics and communities of color in particular regions. So the par for the course is that, unlike what Cambridge Analytica said, which was that demographic politics are dead, in fact, demographic politics are very much alive and well. They've just become more granular. So the kinds of attacks that we see happening these days via Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and many other platforms target, say, Cuban Americans in Miami or Mexican Americans in South Texas, or members of the Indian American community in North Carolina. They are focused across the board in trying to tailor particular narratives socioculturally to particular folks so that they are as potent as possible.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Thank you. The gentleman yields back. At this time, I will recognize, let's see, the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Steele, for member questions, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Butterfield. I have to say, my colleague, Mr. Aguilar, I think there were some missed notes on my colleague, the ranking member of the full committee. I think it's one of these opportunities where it's too bad we're not all in the same room together, because I think we could actually have a robust conversation about what's misleading, what's not. You just look at the House franking rules. Members can use federal dollars to target groups by demographics. My assumption is certain members on this committee are doing just that. And then we get into the question of what's misleading, what's not misleading, and do we want the federal government to be involved in that determination? I say under the First Amendment, you don't want the federal government to make determinations as to what is true and what is not true. Let me shift gears, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity to be in person again. I know some of us on the minority side have chosen to be in person. Let me dive in with you, if I can, Ms. Valencia. In 2020, Facebook Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg gave $350 million to a 501c3 nonprofit organization that in turn distributed those funds to election offices, the majority of which were in Democratic-leaning counties and were used to turn out the vote. In fact, the data shows that they were successful, and those counties received grant funds, saw their results shift towards Democrats. Last year, during a subcommittee hearing, the outgoing elections administrator from Harris County, Texas, testified to this committee that her office used those funds, known as Zuckerbucks, for certain elections administration activities, including purchasing ads on Facebook and other social media platforms. Do you believe election administration activities should be provided by private groups, yes or no?
I do, yes.
Okay, so you do. And so post-election research shows that most of the funding was funneled to Democratic counties and used for get out the vote activities, mailers to register voters and online voter registration drives. So then would you agree that private groups should be able to influence elections administrations in this manner? Are those appropriate uses of nonprofit funds?
I do not, no.
You do not believe those are proper uses of nonprofit funds to put together online voter registration drives, but you do believe that private groups should be able to provide election funds?
If I could expound on my answer beyond just yes or no, I could explain further.
I'll give you a couple seconds.
So I believe that both electoral administration at the state and local level is deeply, deeply underfunded from both the federal government, state, and local jurisdictions. So nonprofits, 501c3s, and other organizations are backfilling what they believe is perhaps underfunding from federal, local, and state governments.
Fair enough. I'll offer my concern on that is that they're directing it with a partisan goal in mind. They're directing that into traditional Democratic communities rather than writ large across a state or geographic region. Let me shift gears if I can to you, my friend, Mr. Corbello, and thank you for being here today. After Castro took over Cuba, your family was directly impacted by this. Individual freedoms, in particular freedom of speech, was destroyed by the government. Could you just take a couple seconds to elaborate further on your personal story with this?
Yeah, and look, I think we have to distinguish. Obviously, that was a revolution, a violent taking of a country, and I don't think we should be comparing the conversations directly. But the point is that there's a reason why people from all over the world come to this country, especially people who are fleeing dictatorial regimes. It's because they can be free here, because they can express themselves, because they can even say things that are factually inaccurate. And the point is that rather than trying to suppress people or trying to silence them, what we should be focused on is how can, for example, election authorities increase their own presence and reach on social media. If you find out that there's a radio station where something is being repeated that is false, maybe people from the government can ask for time to explain. And certainly I think maybe all of us who have been in elected office have done this. When people have lied about us, we usually call in and clear the record, right? I mean, there are much better ways to fight misinformation and disinformation than looking for ways to silence people.
I agree. I'll close just by reading the First Amendment, that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chairman yields back. At this time, it's my pleasure to recognize my new friend, Representative Teresa Ledger Fernandez. I was in Santa Fe, New Mexico a couple of weeks ago and had a very delightful dinner with Teresa and her husband. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Butterfield. I hope you enjoyed our red chili. But this hearing is so important because as we keep recognizing, 2020 historic voter turnout, 4 million more voters, Latino voters participating, and then in response, lots of pernicious work to try to suppress that vote, to try to impact the ability of those Latinos and other communities to get to the vote. And today we heard about the pernicious nature of disinformation, how it threatens our precious democracy. As our experts, Ms. Chi and Joy noted, it's also a threat to our community safety. And I am disappointed to hear my Republican colleagues defend as free speech what is clearly propaganda and misinformation campaigns, clear lies that Ms. Cheney noted are intended to suppress voter turnout. And these often come from places like Russia. They are aimed at undermining our democracy, our trust in government, our trust in news sources. I would hope that our Republican colleagues would denounce Russia's disinformation aimed at Ukraine the same way it's aimed often at our own democracy. And we have laws that require truth in political advertising on traditional media sources, but not online. So it's not that unreasonable, it's quite reasonable, in fact, to prevent disinformation online as proposed in the Honest Ads Act, which requires transparency. It applies the same rules we've all been working under on television, radio, and newspapers, and it would do that to ads sold online. Ms. Valencia, you spoke earlier about the work that ECRIS had done in terms of reaching out to the online sources. I wanted to ask you directly about the memo you sent to YouTube as an example where you listed numerous instances of YouTube leaving up videos riddled with Spanish language disinformation, and these videos violated YouTube's own policies. Did they ever respond to you or take action for these or other instances on their platform?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. YouTube has been somewhat receptive to taking action against Spanish language videos spreading what we would consider disinformation and that violate their terms of service. I'll note about half of what our team has flagged for them, they have taken down. Let me give you a very specific example of a very kind of outright and false claim. Eduardo Manoni, who has over 180,000 subscribers, has been spreading false claims that violate YouTube's terms of service on COVID from 2021. He has multiple channels. One of his channels has 180,000 subscribers, but across multiple channels and multiple platforms, he has many more. Some of the videos that we have flagged from this account to YouTube have been taken down, but his account remains up. Let me give some examples of what those examples of disinformation are. One, a false claim that people who receive the COVID vaccine are dying most of the time. Claims that an approved COVID vaccine will cause death, infertility, miscarriage, autism, or contraction of other infectious diseases, all things that have been not proven. And the third is that a false claim that President Biden received a fake COVID-19 booster shot during a staged event at the White House. The content violated YouTube terms because it was technically manipulated or doctored in a way that misled users. Social News Master 2.0 host promotes conspiracy theory, has promoted a conspiracy theory that the U.S. Air Force plane that evacuated people from Afghanistan was not real, suggesting it was a decoy and inflatable. This claim was rated false by, go ahead.
Thank you. These are examples that just, I don't see how we stand behind them because they are not opinion. They are actually threatening the health of our communities, threatening the health of our democracy. Ms. I wanted to quickly go to a question we had in our hearing in Santa Fe. We heard how very specific texts that were being sent out giving the wrong information on pollings were reported to the FBI and Homeland Security for investigation. What role do you think federal agencies should play in investigating and preventing clear disinformation, clear lies that are intended to mislead people to the wrong place for pollings to stop them from being able to vote?
Absolutely. I mean, look, these new technologies are new ways at old tricks, right? Undermining the right to vote by misleading people, lying to them, sending them to the wrong polling places, telling them to vote on the wrong day. These are all things that we've seen. And just like we see the Department of Justice and other institutions get involved in dealing with those types of voter suppression, we have to see them do it in the online space as well. I don't think we ought to be creating, acting like these are completely unfamiliar things to us. We just, for whatever reason, have decided that this is unique and this is different. What makes it unique is what makes it worse, right? They can be spread so quickly. And once it's out there, even if you correct it later, government agencies are never going to be able to counteract misinformation, misinform as quickly as those who can put it out there. So we need the government to get involved with countering them.
Thank you, Ms. Cheney. My time is up, so I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you to my friend. Thank you for yielding back. At this time, the chair will recognize the ranking member of the full committee, my friend, Rodney Davis.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And let me tell you, I appreciate your congeniality. Appreciate your friendship. I had to go vote on a markup in another committee, and I guess I missed some fireworks. So we'll talk about a bingo card. I wouldn't expect anything less from a member of Speaker Pelosi's leadership team. And it's actually disappointing because my friend, Mr. Aguilar's comments actually demonstrate exactly how the left reacts when they're faced with the truth. That truth doesn't fit their narrative. What they'll do is choose to try and silent those who speak the truth instead. And it's really disappointing to have this debate here. I would love to sit down and talk about any of the comments that I might have made that are not truthful. but we have the congressional record that we can go back to and determine what the truth is. And I think anyone who looks at my comments will realize everything I said was 100% true. And just because you don't agree with that doesn't mean you can try and create a narrative and a debate to try to make them misleading. That's exactly what we're trying to fight here today, right, Mr. Chairman? So I'll start my questions with my good friend, Mr. Curbelo. Mr. Curbelo, I really appreciate you being here today. You were a tremendous legislator, the epitome of bipartisanship during your service in Congress. And I think it's important that this subcommittee has heard your story. I know you've mentioned a few parts about your family story in emigrating from the country of Cuba to the United States. But can you lay out any more experiences that you or your family may have faced when you talk about free speech and really, as you and I have discussed many times from my travels to the country of Cuba, who gets to determine truth? Because your family experienced some of the same things that we're discussing here today.
Well, of course, when the revolution happened, the truth was entirely hijacked, and anyone who would speak out against the government was imprisoned. In some cases, people were executed. And this is nothing that has stopped in the world. We're seeing this in Russia, right? Russians don't actually know what's happening in Ukraine. The one lady who put out a poster board in the middle of a news broadcast in Russia is facing some serious consequences for having done that. So the idea here, and I think especially for those of us who come from families that fled this type of restriction on freedom, is that encroachment is dangerous. And of course, we have the right to regulate all freedoms in this country, and we do. But once we cross that line and we start excluding people from society, banning people from communicating in the public square. And by the way, this is akin to taking someone off a social media site is akin to preventing someone from going to the public square as people used to do and still do sometimes when we see protests in this country. It's just a very dangerous step. And I want to make it very clear, I don't think anyone that has spoken today defends misinformation or disinformation. I certainly condemn it. We just think that there are better tools to fight that kind of activity. Again, when people are lying, it's important for those who know the truth, who have the facts, to go out and confront them. And that may mean investing more in social media. That may mean showing up at a television station, at a radio station, and making sure that your point is heard.
Thank you, Mr. Curbelo. I would like to question Ms. Valencia next, and I'd appreciate some yes and no responses. I don't have a lot of time left. I have a few I want to get through. Ms. Valencia, should news be pre-cleared for truth by the FCC before it's broadcast on public airwaves?
Absolutely not.
Should we have state-run media in the United States?
No.
Who should be determining what is truth and what is fiction? The government?
No.
Should social media companies determine which posts are true and which are disinformation?
Yes.
Should social media companies, if owned by Elon Musk, determine which posts are true and which are disinformation?
Yes.
In your testimony, Ms. Valencia, well, I'm out of time. I'll submit this one for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Davis, for your questions. And we certainly clearly understand that you had to step away from the camera a few moments ago, but welcome back. I will say to the ranking member, however, that the comments made by Mr. Aguilar in your absence, as I recall them, were essentially that your debate today was not related to today's topic. I don't believe he for 1 minute said that you misrepresented the truth. That's not Mr. Aguilar's personality. That's not his style of advocacy. That's not the way he debates it. So we can look at the record and look at the transcript, but I don't believe for 1 moment that he said that you misrepresented the truth. I appreciate your opinion. Can I ask for unanimous consent to submit
into the record 70 letters from voters that the committee Republicans have received on this issue. I forgot to do that in my testimony.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
The 70 letters are received. Thank you. Yeah. All right, the chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. I'm going to start with Ms. Chi, and then I will go to Ms. Cheney. But before I get started, let me just warn Ms. Cheney that I'm going to be asking her to give me 3 examples, one example of misinformation, one of disinformation, one of malinformation. I don't want to blindside you, so start thinking about one example of each one of those, if you will. But let me start with Ms. Chi. Ms. Chi, what are some of the biggest challenges to combating misinformation, disinformation, malinformation in your community, in the AAPI community?
Thank you very much, Chair Butterfield, for your question. There are certainly several issues. Number one is the lack of legitimate and reliable news sources that folks are able to access in their mother tongue or whatever language they're most comfortable in. And so one is the lack of, there's a vacuum currently of legitimate information sources that are available. The second is that, as we mentioned in our testimony, there are a lot of cultural nuances in the Asian American community where, they may be immigrating from countries that have very different politics, government systems and processes. And so they don't necessarily have the familiarity with the US political system or even our, social norms. And so when they are reading content about US politics, local government issues, they don't necessarily have the background to understand what is and is not true because they're bringing their background knowledge from their home countries and also haven't necessarily been formally educated on the systems here. The other challenge is that a lot of this messaging is happening in closed channels, like some of the other witnesses have already shared. So it's difficult for others to fact check or correct incorrect information. And then the last example I'll give is that there isn't a lot of trust in institutions like the government because some of our immigrant communities are coming from authoritarian regimes, governments that were not worthy of their trust. And so messaging from folks that we might see as trusted messengers traditionally, like government officials, like news broadcasters, are not necessarily the right people to correct information here because they do not have the trust of the community.
Thank you. You explained that very well, and I thank you for it. Ms. Cheney, give me one very simple example of each one of these categories.
Yes. So I'm going to give you some examples and you make sure that they are checking off all the boxes here. Look, we talked about these fake influencer accounts, right? We talked about woke Louisa, people pretending to be members of the African-American community. And they may not even be people, right? They may be Russian bots, so if you will, pretending to be members of the Black Lives Matter movement who are saying things that aren't true, telling people that if someone doesn't support reparations, don't go out and vote. People saying things like, so those types of things. So disinformation also can be in the form of saying, hey, certain voters vote on a different day. Those types of information, the textillery ones that I mentioned in my previous testimony. But we also have things that are simply aimed at undermining trust in institutions. One of the things that was said by one of the other witnesses today was that, well, government, you can just fight back. But the problem is, if you have a Russian actor that is aimed at undermining trust in government institutions, and then you have a government actor come out and say those things are not true, who is going to believe them? They are meant to undermine our trust in those very people who would try to get us the right information. So
let me conclude. Let me just conclude with this question because I am running out of time. The National Urban League's 2022 State of Black America report highlights election sabotage or the use of misinformation or disinformation to overturn elections as one of the threats to Black America and to democracy. Could you discuss this in more detail?
I mean, as we go into, there are threats that are currently being made aimed at really exploiting the laws that are passing around the country. So for instance, if you have Texas, where they're changing early voting laws and requiring for mail-in voting certain types of ID restrictions, targeting and making it difficult for people to understand how to implement those laws effectively, are absolutely going to happen. And they are already causing us to see a slowdown in voter turnout for primaries. And we are very concerned about what that means for the fall.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Thank all of you for answering the questions, and just thank you for your patience. Let's see. I think we need to adjourn the hearing, but first let me ask, will there be any other comments from either ranking member? Okay, hearing none. Again, I thank the witnesses for their testimony today. Thank the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for these witnesses, and if so, we will ask you to respond to those in writing. The hearing record will be held open for those responses. And so again, I want to thank everyone for your participation today. And without objection, the subcommittee on elections stands adjourned.
Thank you.